Having the L of the director's first name fade in as soon as the movie ended was very fitting.
My watch costs 50 bands and I still don't have time for you fuckboys.
Back in the early years, much of Hollywood was built on the success of horror movies. Universal horror movies to be specific. Dracula, The Mummy, The Wolfman, The Invisible Man, Frankenstein, and many more. It's often referred to as the golden age of horror. These were absolute classics and are still looked back on to this day. They were massive successes back then, and since their release, there has been several attempts at remakes, reboots, and new adaptations. But very few of those are held in as high regard as classics. And this leads us to Saw.
Game over.
Stay with me now. Saw released back in 2004, over 20 years ago now, and was a huge hit, and popularized what is often called the torture porn subgenre of horror. But we're not here to talk about Saw. Instead, I want to talk about the men behind it, James Wan and Leigh Whannell. This movie launched their careers, and they went on to work on several projects together, usually with Leigh Whannell writing and James Wan directing. Now, you're probably still wondering what this has to do with the classic Universal monsters, and I'll get there. You see, after several years of collaborating together, Wan and Whannell went their separate ways in their career. Nothing happened between them, they just started working on different projects. James Wan started working on Fury 7, Aquaman, and the Conjuring films, while Leigh Whannell decided to take a stab at directing, making his directorial debut with Insidious Chapter 3 in 2015, a film franchise he helped to create back in 2010. And honestly, it was a pretty solid movie, not a bad debut. He immediately started working on his next project, Upgrade, and it was a hit, and really started to get people to look at his directing skills. So honestly, not a bad start to his directing career, but it's what he decided to do after this that relates to today's subject. With 2 films under his belt, he set his sights on remaking some of the classic Universal monsters, The Invisible Man and Wolfman specifically. And if you see the title of this video, then you kind of know how he did.
What the fuck happened? Hey!
Yeah, truth be told, he hit it out of the park the first time with The Invisible Man, but then he tripped on his way to the plate with his second attempt. And it's baffling because he wrote and directed both. He worked with the same studios. I didn't read or hear anything about behind the scenes issues, so it's surprising that there's such a sharp drop in quality in between movies, especially coming off 3 good movies back to back to back. And personally, as a fan of his, who was actually looking forward to this movie, it's just very disappointing. Now, do I hate it and think it's the worst remake out there? No. It's a massive letdown for sure, with a very noticeable drop in quality from his previous films. But I don't think it's absolutely horrible and the worst thing out there. But of course, I am biased because I like the director, and it just sucks seeing a filmmaker you like make a pretty bad movie. Trust me, I know the pain all too well. So I was thinking, how best to approach this? How can I talk about and compare these 2 movies? They have some similarities, sure, that being the remakes of classic horror films written and directed by the same guy, but the content within each film is vastly different. So I guess what I can do is briefly talk about why The Invisible Man works, and why it's so praised, and then talk about Wolfman and what it does wrong and where it stumbles. Now, of course, I'm going to assume at this point you've seen The Invisible Man, so there might be some spoilers here and there. And that section is going to be much more brief than the Wolfman section, but I at least want to talk about it for a bit. So let's get into it. The Invisible Man released back in 2020, and even though it was a bit overshadowed by other things happening at that time, it still received overwhelmingly positive reviews and a modest box office pool, all things considered at the time. We follow the story of Cecilia. She escapes an abusive relationship but finds out that her ex, who spent years terrorizing her, took his own life and left her with his fortune. But just when she thinks she's free of him, she starts getting tormented by, well, an invisible man, leading her to believe that her ex isn't actually dead and is somehow messing with her. But as the movie goes on and no one believes her, it drives her more and more towards the brink of insanity. Honestly, this is one of the very few movies where I think it's well executed in nearly every aspect. The scare sequences are creative as hell, leading to some pretty impressive camera work, but more importantly, there are smaller moments that make you question if something is even happening in the first place, making you second guess what you're looking at, just like the main character. Speaking of which, her acting is top notch. She just looks so stressed out, which fuels the stress that you feel as a viewer. And just like her, you want to shake the people around her to make them believe that someone is actually there. It's honestly really good, at least at several moments where you're just unnerved watching this woman get her life ruined. Not to mention, the sound design is also great. Since you can't see the force that is terrorizing her, it makes you listen closely because there's a few times where you can only hear him breathing or moving around. And there are several times where the camera just holds steady with no music and it's just the character on screen. And you're watching and listening to see if he's there. These are the small creative scares and tense moments I was talking about earlier. Yeah, this is a tense nail biter through and through, and I can't recommend it enough. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out because I'm about to spoil it. So what this new version of The Invisible Man did well was take a concept and tell a new interesting story with it. You see, not only does this take place in a modern setting, but they use science and technology in a fresh way. You see, in the original, the scientist did an experiment on himself to turn invisible, where he then takes advantage of that and starts to become a menace. In the 2020 remake, the ex-boyfriend is in a camouflage suit to be invisible and fake his own death so that he can torment her. So it keeps the science aspect of it, but changes it a bit to more so advanced technology, as opposed to an experiment. And then it mixes it with a story of a girl being tormented by her crazy ex. Again, keeping with the concept of the original, where the Invisible Man starts terrorizing people. It's a pretty pretty fresh take, and I think it's done pretty damn well. Reimagining gets thrown around a lot, but that's kind of what this is, I guess. It takes similar concepts and points from the original and then tells a whole new story with it. Now, of course, changing things drastically can be risky. If you change too much, you run the risk of it being so different that no one likes it. I don't believe this movie had that problem at all. I thought it did a great job at putting a fresh take on a classic concept. So after hearing all this, I guess it's time to talk about Wolfman not doing any of that.
Doesn't this seem like too much stuff?
Well, I'm coming. Holy fuck.
Wolfman is about a man who got news that his father is declared deceased after going missing, and is given the keys to his old house out in the middle of nowhere. So it takes his family out there to clear out the place, and to get away from the city. But on the way there, they crash, and are attacked by a creature of sorts. They make it to the house, but now the father is changing and turned into a monster. That's right, he's a werewolf. So now they must deal with the werewolf outside stalking them, and the father inside turning into one. So where to begin? Well, for starters, unlike Invisible Man, it didn't really add much of a fresh take on a classic concept. Werewolves, much like vampires, have been done to death, so you have to find new ways to keep it interesting. And there are a few things that it does try that I will get into, but when comparing it to Invisible Man, it feels more generic. Now, there isn't anything wrong with sticking to something that's more familiar. At that point, it's about the execution and how well they pull it off. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't even do that well. Even though there are some new additions to mix things up, it's not enough to carry the whole movie, and it's lacking in several areas, which makes it feel like a drag at times, which is a shame because there are some really interesting ideas in here. Now, I will say it doesn't start off that bad. The first 30 or 40 minutes are pretty decent. The intro and setup are fine, and the interesting twist that they present here is the father's perspective. As he's transforming, he starts to lose his ability to speak, and he also can't understand his family. He becomes more savage, his teeth and hair are falling out, and his senses are extremely heightened, leading to super hearing and being able to see in the dark. And when these sections happen, they're pretty damn cool. Just seeing how he views the world is honestly one of the most entertaining parts of the movie. Now, the only issue is it lacks almost everywhere else. The family dynamic is lukewarm, so when it's supposed to be emotional, it just doesn't really hit, because these characters don't feel all that close at all. But an even bigger issue is that the movie places so much focus on this transformation stuff, which again is still pretty cool, but because it's so focused on it for so long, it starts to drag out. And this movie isn't long. It's only an hour and 40 minutes. And with most of its attention placed on the father slowly changing, it leads to the last 15 minutes just being completely rushed. And not to mention, there's a big lack of werewolf in this werewolf movie. Yeah, they spend so much time on the transformation that there's not much time left for the werewolf they're hiding from, or for the father when he finally becomes one. Now, I respect hiding the monster and letting it operate off screen until finally revealing it, but it's dragged out for so long. And when you finally see it, it looks, I mean, it's okay, I guess. It's just not worth the wait, especially when everything is crammed in the last 15 minutes. Yeah, it takes about 40 minutes for the father to start changing, then about another 30 to 40 minutes for him to actually become one, and then he's werewolf for the last like 10 or 15 minutes. There are just several underbaked aspects. Not only barely seeing the werewolf, but also the family dynamic. Not just with his wife and daughter, but there's another one involving the main guy's father, and it's just very shallow. In the beginning, they show the main guy as a kid with his dad, and basically the relationship just really isn't that good, and he's like really obsessed with like finding this creature in the woods, which of course is the werewolf. But it really isn't delved into at all. So much feels very cookie cutter, the characters and the story. So personally, I found myself not really caring for like the last 30 minutes or so. The movie felt like a drag, but it's not a long movie, so that's a really bad sign. Okay, I'm being a little harsh, so let me say some more good things. It's not all bad. At times, it's a really good looking movie. There are some pretty solid shots and some good camera work, but we kind of expect that at this point. And the stuff with the father transforming is pretty neat for the most part, and have some of the more visually interesting stuff going on. And that's really about it. It starts off pretty decent, but it just kind of turns into a drag halfway through. It placed so much attention on the father transforming that it kind of forgot that it needed interesting characters and actual werewolves in this werewolf movie. So unfortunately, by the end, Wolfman has a few interesting ideas and some cool sequences, but there really isn't much else there, and everything that is pretty underbaked. There's nothing to really elevate this movie to even mediocre status. I don't hate it, and I thought the first half was pretty decent, but it just started to drag on, and then it just had a very lukewarm, rushed ending. Instead of giving a fresh and interesting take like The Invisible Man did, it decided to fall back on a more traditional story structure, which is fine, but it doesn't even pull that off that well. So you're left with a movie that is pretty decent looking with some interesting ideas that is mid at best and boring at worst. And man, that hurts to say. And just judging from the reviews and the box office pool, it seems most people agree that this is a miss. Again, I want to reiterate that I don't think this is a terrible movie. It's definitely not that good, but for me personally, it's just a very disappointing movie. Now, I'm still a fan of Leigh Whannell, and I'm definitely going to be interested in whatever his next project is, but this is definitely his first miss, when it comes to directing anyway. But yeah, Wolfman, pretty disappointing. I don't got shit else to say, so see ya.
I had a dream I fucked your brains out.
Mercy blows! Oh, they're gonna give me a heart attack.